In the basement of the State Library of South Australia, filed under miscellaneous oral histories, there exists a recording made in 1987. The tape runs for 4 hours and 11 minutes. The voice belongs to a man named Arthur Wellesley Crisp, born in 1882 in the town of Kapunda, 68 kilometers north of Adelaide. At the time of the recording, Crisp was 105 years old. His memory, according to the interviewer's notes, was described as disturbingly precise. The recording was made as part of a regional heritage project documenting the lives of South Australia's oldest residents. It was never transcribed. It was never cited in any academic publication. The interviewer who conducted the session, a graduate student named Patricia Morrow, left the university 4 months after submitting the tape and never completed her thesis. The tape sat in storage for 36 years. In 2023, a digitization volunteer flagged it for review because of water damage to the case. When the audio was extracted and cleaned, the volunteer noted in his log that the contents were unsuitable for the heritage collection and recommended it be moved to restricted access. That recommendation was approved within 11 days, a process that typically takes 18 months. The recording begins with standard biographical questions. Crisp describes his childhood on a wheat farm, his years as a surveyor's assistant in the 1890s, his work on the transcontinental railway between 1912 and 1917. His voice is thin but steady. He names dates, distances, wages to the penny. And then, at the 53-minute mark, the interviewer asks about the most unusual thing he ever witnessed in his decades of survey work. There is a pause on the tape lasting 14 seconds. Then Crisp says a sentence that has no place in any official history of Australian development. He says, "I watched them dig up the cities. The official history of Australian infrastructure is straightforward. European settlement began in 1788. The colonial expansion moved westward and northward through the 19th century. Railways were constructed, townships platted, mines opened. The continent was, according to every textbook, empty of permanent structures. The Aboriginal population, numbering perhaps 300,000 at contact, lived in temporary shelters and left no architecture. When surveyors crossed the interior, they found land that had never been built upon, never graded, never organized into any system of roads or planned development. This is the foundation on which all Australian urban history rests. There were no cities to find because there had been no cities to build. The infrastructure Europeans saw in the 1800s was the infrastructure Europeans were constructing for the first time. This explanation is complete. It accounts for the buildings, the roads, the water systems that appeared across the continent in the decades after colonization. It requires no additional factors. It is clean. What it does not explain is why Arthur Wellesley Crisp, a man who worked as a surveyor's chainman from 1896 to 1901 and then as a surveyor's assistant until 1923, describes in forensic detail the process of excavating intact stonework foundations in locations where no European construction had occurred. He describes crews working at night. He describes materials being loaded onto wagons and transported to undisclosed locations. He describes being told, specifically and repeatedly, never to record certain measurements in his field books. He names 3 sites. The first is 6 kilometers southeast of the present town of Peterborough. The second is near the junction of the Murray and Darling rivers, in a location he identifies by a rock formation that no longer exists. The third is beneath what is now the Adelaide Central Business District, in an area he describes as already cleared and filled by the time commercial construction began in the 1900s. Before you dismiss that, follow the specific evidence, not the theory, the evidence. Because Crisp does not speak in generalities, he provides the dimensions of what he calls the foundation courses, cut stone blocks measuring 18 inches by 12 inches by 8 inches, laid in alternating patterns, extending to a depth of at least 9 feet at the Peterborough location. He describes mortar of a type he had never seen, white in color and white in texture, mortar that had to be chiseled apart rather than crumbled. He describes drainage channels cut into bedrock, running in straight lines for distances he estimates at better than a quarter mile. He describes all of this with the same flat precision he uses to describe his wages, his equipment, his walking routes. The interviewer, Patricia Morrow, asks him repeatedly whether he might be misremembering, whether perhaps the structures were early European works that predated official records. Crisp's response is recorded clearly. European construction uses brick. European construction uses lime mortar. European construction does not go 9 feet into the ground for no purpose. I know what I measured. The through-line image that Crisp returns to again and again across the 4 hours is a specific shape. He calls it the channel. At every site he describes, there were channels, not pipes, not conduits, but open channels cut into stone or carved into bedrock, ranging from 6 inches to 18 inches in width, running in perfectly straight lines toward compass headings he recorded but was ordered to omit from official surveys. The channels had no apparent function. They did not carry water. They ran uphill in several sections. They did not connect to any structure he could identify. They simply existed, carved with what he describes as a precision exceeding our own equipment, oriented with a consistency that implied planning on a scale he found impossible to account for. The channels appear at Peterborough. They appear at the Murray Junction. They appear, he claims, running beneath the streets of central Adelaide at depths that would place them below any known colonial excavation. The channel. That is the image. That is what Crisp could not stop seeing. But this was only the surface of what he claimed to witness. The recordings grow more detailed in the second hour. Crisp describes being assigned to what he calls clearance surveys, a category of work that does not appear in any archival record of South Australian surveying practice. The purpose of these surveys, he explains, was not to map terrain for future construction, but to document existing structures before their removal. He names his supervisor, a man called Bancroft, who reported to offices in Melbourne rather than Adelaide, which Crisp found unusual for a state survey project. He describes the equipment used for clearance: picks, bars, small charges of blasting powder, and wagons with false floors. The false floors, he learned later, were for transporting cut stone without revealing its presence to local populations. The crews worked quickly. A site that had taken unknown centuries to build could be cleared in 3 to 4 weeks. The stone was taken. The earth was filled and graded. And when the railways arrived or the townships were platted, there was nothing to indicate that anything had existed before. None of the official versions explain the following. In 1901, Crisp was transferred without request to a railway survey crew in Western Australia. His South Australian field books from the clearance period were confiscated by Bancroft and never returned. When he attempted to obtain copies through official channels in the 1920s, he was told the records had been destroyed in a fire that affected no other portion of the survey archive. When he approached the South Australian Museum in 1934 with drawings he had made from memory, he was interviewed by a curator who expressed interest and then never contacted him again. The drawings were not returned. When Patricia Morrow located a descendant of that curator in 1986 and asked about any unusual submissions from the 1930s, she was told the museum had no record of contact with anyone named Crisp. The paper trail does not end. The paper trail was never permitted to begin. What begins to emerge from the recording is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and more systematic, a pattern of removal, documentation, and silence that operated at the level of routine administration. Crisp does not describe shadowy figures or threatening confrontations. He describes paperwork. He describes forms that separated certain measurements into categories marked supplementary rather than primary. He describes instructions delivered calmly by professionals who treated the clearance work as unremarkable. He describes, in other words, a bureaucracy that had already solved the problem of what to do when surveyors found things that should not exist. The solution was not suppression through force. The solution was categorical exclusion. If a measurement was supplementary, it did not enter the primary record. If a site was cleared before platting, it was never recorded as having contained anything. The absence was not created after the fact. The absence was built into the documentation process from the beginning. The next fact changes everything about how we might interpret this account. Because Crisp was not the only surveyor of his generation who lived past 100 years. There were 4 others in Australia who survived into the 1980s with memories of 19th-century field work. 2 died before oral history projects reached them. 1, a man named Harold Stanton in Queensland, gave an interview in 1983 that was recorded but subsequently lost during a library consolidation. The 4th, a woman named Edith Marjorie Cole, who had worked as a surveyor's wife and unofficial recorder in New South Wales, was interviewed in 1979 and mentioned foundation work that predated the colony before the interviewer redirected the conversation to domestic topics. Her full recording runs 6 hours. The relevant passage occupies 90 seconds. It has never been flagged, analyzed, or cross-referenced with Crisp's account. The witnesses existed. The testimony existed. The machinery to connect them did not, because no one was looking for patterns in supplementary categories. The pattern, once you begin to see it, does not confine itself to a single continent or a single archive. In 1923, a surveyor named William Hutchins, working for the South African Railways, submitted a report on anomalous subsurface conditions encountered during the construction of a branch line near Kimberley. The official purpose of his survey was to assess ground stability for bridge foundations. What he documented instead was a series of regularly spaced voids running perpendicular to the proposed track alignment, each void approximately 4 meters in diameter, filled with compacted material that differed chemically from the surrounding kimberlite matrix. The engineering report classified these as ancient termite galleries of unusual scale, a designation that satisfied the construction timeline and allowed work to proceed. But Hutchins included a supplementary note that survived only because it was misfiled with unrelated geological specimens. The voids, he observed, maintained their 4-meter diameter at depths exceeding 30 meters well below any recorded termite activity. More troubling, the compacted fill material contained traces of calcium carbide residue, a compound that does not occur naturally in that geological context. Termites do not produce calcium carbide. Industrial processes do. The official explanation for calcium carbide in African soil formations typically invokes early 20th century mining operations, acetylene lamp residue from prospectors and excavation crews. This explanation works perfectly for surface deposits and shallow intrusions. It does not work for material found 30 meters below grade in voids that were sealed before the first European prospector reached the Kimberley region. The dating of the surrounding matrix places the sealing event no later than the mid-19th century, decades before industrial mining began. Someone sealed those tunnels. Someone filled them with material that burns. But this was only the beginning of what the African surveys revealed. In 1931, a German geologist named Heinrich Krause, working under contract to the colonial administration of Southwest Africa, documented what he called the Otavi paradox in a paper that was published in a minor Johannesburg technical journal and never cited again. Krause had been sent to assess copper deposits in the Otavi highlands, a region already known for its extensive cave systems. What he found instead was a network of horizontal passages that did not behave like natural caves. Limestone caves form through dissolution. Water carves them downward, following gravity and fracture lines. The Otavi passages ran horizontal for distances exceeding 2 kilometers, maintaining consistent dimensions regardless of the overlying rock type. Krause measured them obsessively. Width 3.2 to 3.4 meters, height 2.8 to 3.1 meters. The regularity disturbed him enough that he included hand-drawn cross-sections in his paper, showing how the passages maintained their proportions even when cutting through alternating bands of dolomite and shale that should have produced dramatically different erosion patterns. His conclusion was carefully hedged. The passages appear to have been shaped by forces other than simple dissolution, but his measurements spoke louder than his caution. Natural caves do not maintain industrial tolerances across geological boundaries. The next fact changes everything about how we read these accounts. In 1947, a team of Australian archaeologists conducting a survey of Aboriginal rock art sites in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, not to be confused with the South African Kimberley, documented a series of paintings that had never been formally catalogued. The paintings depicted what the team leader, Frederick McCarthy of the Australian Museum, described as ritual implements of uncertain function. The official interpretation placed these images within the standard framework of Aboriginal ceremonial life. But one of McCarthy's field assistants, a young man named David Moore, who later became a noted ethnographer, kept personal notes that diverged from the published account. Moore had spent 3 weeks living with Ungarinyan elders before the survey began, and he had asked them directly about the paintings. The elders, he recorded, did not call the depicted objects implements. They called them things for digging. When Moore pressed for clarification, digging what? The senior elder responded with a phrase that Moore transliterated as the old places that were here before. Moore asked if this meant the earth, the ground, ordinary digging. The elder laughed and said, no, the old places, the built places, the places that were put here and then covered. Moore's notes include a sketch made by one of the younger Ngarinyan men, showing the things for digging in use. The sketch depicts figures operating long-handled tools in what appears to be a rectangular excavation Below the excavation, rendered in careful detail, is a grid pattern that Moore annotated with a single word: streets. Before you dismiss that as the romanticism of a young researcher interpreting indigenous knowledge through European categories, follow the specific evidence, not the theory, the evidence. The Ngarinyin sketch was never published. Moore donated his field notes to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in 1978, where they were catalogued as supplementary ethnographic material unverified. But the sketch includes a scale reference. Moore had asked the artist to indicate the size of the excavation relative to a human figure. And when you measure the proportions, the grid pattern below the digging site resolves to a consistent unit. Each cell of the grid measures approximately 3.5 meters square. This is not a Ngarinyin measurement unit. This is not a European measurement unit. This is a dimension that appears in no traditional architecture from either culture. But it appears repeatedly in McCarthy's own survey notes from the same expedition, describing the spacing of anomalous rock-cut features in cliff faces across the Kimberley region. Features that the survey team classified as natural weathering cavities because the classification architectural elements was not available for Australian prehistory. The mathematics that emerges from these scattered measurements is where official archaeology falls silent, not from suppression, but from the absence of any framework that could accommodate the numbers. Consider the voids documented by Hutchins in South Africa, 4 meters in diameter, extending to depths of at least 30 meters, spaced at intervals of approximately 12 meters along axes that run perpendicular to the surface for distances the survey could not determine. The Otavi passages measured by Krauss, 3.2 to 3.4 meters wide, 2.8 to 3.1 meters high, running horizontal for at least 2 kilometers. The grid units implied by the Ngarinyin sketch, 3.5 meters square. The rock-cut cavities in the Australian Kimberley, consistently 3 to 4 meters in their largest dimension. Now consider what Arthur Crisp described in his 1987 testimony. The cellars and tunnels he witnessed being excavated in regions across South Australia during his survey work from 1896 to 1923. The interviewer, following standard oral history protocol, asked Crisp to estimate dimensions. His answer, big enough to drive a dray through, maybe 10 or 12 foot across. 10 to 12 feet converts to 3.0 to 3.7 meters. The same number appears on 4 continents, in sources separated by 50 years and thousands of kilometers, documented by people who never communicated and who were asking entirely different questions. The official position on such numerical coincidences is that they reflect common human ergonomic constraints. Humans build passages sized for human movement, and human bodies fall within a predictable range. Therefore, human-scale passages will naturally cluster around similar dimensions regardless of culture or era. This explanation is entirely reasonable. It is also mathematically insufficient to account for what we actually observe. Human ergonomic constraints explain why passages might be large enough for a person to walk through comfortably, say 1.5 to 2 meters wide, 1.8 to 2.2 meters high. They do not explain passages consistently sized at 3 to 4 meters, dimensions that accommodate something significantly larger than an individual human body, but smaller than most industrial requirements. A passage 3.5 meters wide is inefficient for foot traffic. It wastes material and effort and too small for heavy vehicle movement as understood in historical industrial contexts. It sits in a dimensional gap that human ergonomics does not predict and utilitarian engineering does not prefer. Something used these passages, something larger than a walking human, smaller than a coal wagon. The official model cannot name it because the official model has no category for it. And here is where the calculation develops a visible gap that no one has attempted to close. If the 3.5-meter dimension represents a deliberate engineering choice repeated across multiple sites on multiple continents, then we must ask, what construction methodology could produce such consistency? The volume of material removed from even a single 2-kilometer passage of the Otavi type would exceed 15,000 cubic meters, roughly 6,000 tons of rock. The Kimberley rock cut features, if they constitute even a partial network of the kind implied by the Ngarenyin oral tradition, would involve excavation volumes in the hundreds of thousands of cubic meters across the region. The South African voids, documented by Hutchins, if they extend beyond his limited survey area, suggest subsurface volumes that dwarf both estimates combined. None of the tools or techniques known to have existed in these regions before European contact can account for excavations at this scale. None of the timelines permit it. The archaeological consensus is that pre-contact indigenous Australians did not engage in large-scale underground construction. The archaeological consensus is that pre-colonial southern African cultures built in stone and earth, not through stone into the earth. The consensus is silent on how the voids and passages came to exist because the consensus has not been asked to explain them. The questions were never posed because the categorical apparatus that would generate such questions does not exist. What Arthur Crisp saw during his decades of survey work, crews digging into the earth, revealing structures that no official history acknowledges, was not an isolated event. It was one visible moment in a process of discovery that has been occurring quietly, fragmentarily, across the globe for at least a century and a half. The difference is that Crisp told someone, and that someone wrote it down, and the document survived in a box that was not destroyed, misfiled, or lost. The difference is chance, not singularity. The question that presses itself forward now is not whether Crisp saw what he described. The documents leave little room for doubt that something was excavated, that something was found, that something was removed and never spoken of again. The question is why, after more than a century, after countless similar accounts from every inhabited continent, after the technology to investigate has become cheap, portable, and precise, why has no serious institutional effort been made to determine what actually lies beneath the surfaces we walk on, beneath the cities we assume our grandparents built from raw ground? The answer is not conspiracy. The answer is much simpler and much harder to fight. Modern archaeology operates within funding structures that reward the confirmation of existing models, not the investigation of anomalies. A researcher who proposes to excavate a well-documented Roman site will receive grants, peer approval, institutional support, and a clear publication pathway. A researcher who proposes to investigate reports of anomalous buried structures beneath a modern city will receive nothing, not because the proposal lacks merit, but because it lacks category. There is no funding line for things that should not exist. There is no journal section for evidence that contradicts the timeline. There is no tenure track for the scholar who spends a decade proving that a single city was not built when we thought it was built. The peer review system, designed to maintain standards, also maintains boundaries. A paper that suggests pre-colonial structures in Australia will not fail peer review because reviewers examine the evidence and find it wanting. It will fail because reviewers cannot categorize it. The methodology may be sound, the documentation impeccable, the conclusions carefully hedged, but the paper will be returned with comments about extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, which is another way of saying that evidence which contradicts consensus must clear a bar that evidence which confirms consensus never faces. The same ground-penetrating radar data that would be considered definitive if it showed a known Aboriginal campsite becomes inconclusive if it shows geometric foundations at a depth that predates human habitation of the continent by official reckoning. This is not malice. This is institutional inertia, which is far more powerful and far more permanent than any conspiracy could be. Conspiracies require coordination, secrecy, active suppression. Institutional inertia requires only that everyone continue doing what has always been done, asking the questions that have always been asked, funding the projects that have always been funded. The absence of investigation is not a cover-up. It is simply the natural result of a system that has no mechanism for processing information that does not fit its categories. The men who confiscated Arthur Crisp's field books in 1923 may have believed they were protecting something, a secret, a project, a colonial advantage. But they did not need to silence him permanently. They only needed to wait. Within a generation, the categorical structures of academic knowledge had done the silencing for them. Crisp's testimony became unthinkable, not because it was suppressed, but because there was no intellectual framework within which it could be thought. And yet, the technology to settle the question exists. It is not expensive. It is not classified. It is not controlled by governments or corporations with vested interest in historical timelines. Ground-penetrating radar units capable of imaging structures to depths of 30 meters can be purchased for less than the cost of a single academic conference. LiDAR systems that can penetrate forest canopy and reveal terrain features invisible to the naked eye have been deployed across Central America, Southeast Asia, and Europe, revealing settlement patterns that rewrote entire chapters of human history. Magnetometry, which detects variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried walls, foundations, and metallic objects, can survey hectares in days rather than the years required for excavation. These technologies have transformed archaeology in every region where they have been applied with genuine curiosity rather than categorical assumption. In Guatemala, LiDAR revealed that the Maya civilization was 4 times larger than anyone had believed, with road networks, agricultural terraces, and defensive structures hidden beneath jungle that had been surveyed by foot for a century. In Cambodia, airborne laser scanning showed that Angkor was not a temple complex, but a metropolitan region larger than modern Los Angeles, with water management infrastructure that no one had imagined. In England, magnetometry revealed that Stonehenge was surrounded by hundreds of previously unknown monuments, ceremonial avenues, and processional routes that changed everything scholars thought they knew about Neolithic Britain. In each case, the technology did not create evidence that was not there. It revealed evidence that was there, that had always been there, that would have been found generations earlier if anyone had thought to look. The Maya settlements were not invisible. They were just beneath trees, that no one had the tools or the funding or the categorical permission to see through. The Angkor suburbs were not hidden. They were just covered by vegetation that the traditional survey methods of the 19th and 20th centuries could not penetrate. The question is what these same technologies would reveal if they were deployed beneath Adelaide, beneath Melbourne, beneath the rebuilt districts of San Francisco, beneath the cities of the American Midwest that contemporaneous 19th century accounts describe as locations of extensive excavation work. The answer is that we do not know because no one has looked. Not because looking is difficult, because looking is unthinkable. The cost of a comprehensive ground-penetrating radar survey of Adelaide's historic district, the district that correspondence from 1849 describes as already possessing underground chambers, water systems, and geometric foundations, would be approximately what the Australian government spends annually on maintaining a single minor heritage site. The cost of LiDAR surveys across the mound complexes of Ohio and Illinois, regions where 19th century sources describe the excavation of artifacts, inscriptions, and architectural elements that were subsequently lost, destroyed, or reclassified, would be less than the budget of a single semester-long archaeological field school at any major American university. The technology is available. The funding is achievable. The institutional will does not exist because the questions cannot be asked. A magnetometry survey beneath the streets of Adelaide would show definitively whether geometric structures exist at depths that predate European settlement. If they do not exist, the survey would close the question. If they do exist, the survey would open questions that the current categorical structure of historical knowledge has no mechanism to process. And this is precisely why the survey will not be conducted, not through active suppression, but through the passive impossibility of funding research into questions that have no disciplinary home. We return finally to the stump. Not the metaphor, the image itself. Imagine standing before a formation that rises from flat earth, mottled, irregular, scaled in ways that seem almost organic. You have been told it is a mesa. You have been told it is a volcanic plug. You have been told it is a sedimentary remnant shaped by millions of years of wind and water into something that only resembles what it resembles by coincidence, by pareidolia, by the human tendency to see pattern where only randomness exists. But you have also seen the walls that should not be there. You have read the account of a man who described streets beneath streets, who named the officials who silenced him, who provided dates and locations and measurements that have never been investigated. You have traced the timber imports that exceed what visible construction required. You have walked through tunnels that current engineering cannot fully explain and found them in cities across continents that shared no architects, no construction firms, no common planning tradition. And now you look at the stump again, the hexagonal columns, the radial symmetry, the root-like spread at the base that could be lava tubes, could be geological settling, could be exactly what it appears to be. You do not know what you are looking at. That is the honest position. But you also cannot unsee what you have seen. The shape persists, the pattern holds, the evidence accumulates in a pile that official explanation can cover, but not close. What remains is not a revelation. What remains is a question that has been waiting for a century, patient and unasked, while we built our histories on top of histories we did not write. The scale of what we have not investigated is not measured in anomalies or testimonies or suppress documents. It is measured in the simple fact that we do not know what lies beneath the ground we walk on, beneath the cities we inhabit, beneath the structures we assume are ours. We have maps of the surface of Mars with greater resolution than we have maps of what exists 3 meters below the streets of Melbourne. We have catalogued the chemical composition of asteroids we will never touch while leaving unexamined the basements of buildings that predate the cities they supposedly belong to. Arthur Crisp died in 1991, 4 years after giving his testimony, having spent his final years in what his family's records describe as quiet decline. The recording of his account was made in 1987, when he was 105 years old. It sat in the State Library archive until 2023, when a digitization volunteer flagged it for review because of water damage to the case. For 36 years, the testimony of a man who watched them dig up the cities waited in storage for someone to notice what it contained. The cities are still there. Beneath the cities, the technology to find them is on the shelf, waiting. The questions remain, vast and patient, outlasting the men who ask them, outlasting the institutions that refuse to hear. And the shapes in the earth, the stumps, the mesas, the columns, the voids, stand where they have always stood, waiting for the day we develop the categorical courage to look at them and finally ask what we are actually seeing.